ATF agreed to, in 2012, should not be under the jurisdiction of your rule?
Conventional wisdom was we would never get any Republicans to support gun legislation, period.
The ATF decided to change a regulation or an interpretation of the regulation, and so they may just want to SBR right off the bat.
To do anything about what the president is doing to exercise that authority unconstitutionally, as was the case with student loans.
Supreme Court ruling and remand order backs all assault weapon bans into a corner. One court ruled that federal law cannot bar someone from owning a gun just because that person is subject to a domestic violence restraining order. Another decided that preventing someone convicted of a non-violent felony from owning a gun is unconstitutional. And a third found the federal law prohibiting people under 21 from owning firearms is unlawful. All of these recent rulings by lower federal courts are the product of court decisions striking blows against long-standing federal gun restrictions that were issued by lower court judges in the past year after the Supreme Court in a sweeping ruling.
To actually make laws without congressional approval. They're really there to enforce laws.
Blatantly denying the power grab being carried out by the executive branch yet again.
The uptick in violence has just been astronomical. The gun violence.
As a kid, I came out of a different movement, the civil rights movement.
Who showed up here said one thing that felt good about doing this kind of event was that they felt empowered.
Expanded gun rights by finding for the first time that the Constitution's Second Amendment right to bear arms extends outside the home. The decision by the Supreme Court's 6-3 conservative majority has led to a flurry of challenges to long-standing laws, both federal and state, and prompted some judges to find they are unlawful under the new standard. Other judges have upheld gun restrictions, creating divisions on the law across the country. It has also led to blue states passing a new wave of gun laws in the hope that they will not fall foul of the Supreme Court's rationale.
Pretty clear about the extent to which this is an abuse of the Administrative Procedures Act.
Is it a difficult question to understand?
Well, I'm sure it's enormously high.
It's 36 per 100,000 people.
With it off safe, just that little bit of motion, you can hear the click.
I just felt that I needed to be able to protect myself.
Back in court. Now the issue is back on the Supreme Court's doorstep again, with the Biden administration asking the court to reverse the lower court ruling that invalidated the federal law barring people subject to domestic violence restraining orders from possessing firearms.
Because he doesn't care about separation of powers either.
The Texas House of Representatives just voted to impeach Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton.
How many guns has the ATF lost? I'm not sure I understand the question.
It will shoot, then it comes back forward. The rifle will then cycle and cock again.
The extent to which this is an unconstitutional violation of our Second Amendment rights. But what is also true is that it is incumbent upon the United States Congress, the House of Representatives in particular.
Weim says the Missouri law exposes people to greater harm by interfering with the federal government's ability to enforce firearms regulations.
The justices are scheduled to discuss in private whether to hear the case in what will be the first real test of how broadly the court's conservative majority wants its 2022 ruling to be interpreted. The new test the Supreme Court adopted in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin requires judges to focus solely on whether a law comports with a historical understanding of the Second Amendment.
And having to tell her that other 9-year-olds were just killed in a shooting is horrific.
And so when you keep going forward like this, it has to go through the 7 cycles of fire.
Get on the ground now!
I'm a federal agent.
917-110-3.
I'm a federal agent.
Get on the ground!
Field background checks could stop a lot of illegal guns going in different places in the country.
This shall not be infringed, and the word infringe means by banning parts on firearms actually is against the Constitution.
The conservative majority in deciding Bruin appeared concerned that lower courts had not cast a more skeptical eye on gun restrictions after the Supreme Court's previous major gun rights ruling in 2008. The immediate impact of Bruin seems to suggest that lower courts, which have tilted to the right in recent years because of the appointments made by former President Donald Trump, have received the message this time. Quote, "Now we see not only more decisions more quickly, but we see decisions striking down laws not thought to raise serious Second Amendment problems in the first place," said Jake Charles, an expert on firearms law at Pepperdine University's law school.
It takes extraordinary courage for them to stand up here and retell the story.
Anti-gunners put in there to keep the guns out of the hands of lawful citizens in New York State.
It had no difference to this guy. Straight up, this guy was evil. I mean, he committed murder.
Affect us here, and it was such a breath of fresh air for the Second Amendment people.
Domestic violence claims. While gun rights activists have taken aim at state and local restrictions in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling, a key battleground is on a series of federal restrictions that are listed in a section of law called 18 U.S. Code Section 922. One of those provisions, 922G8, concerns anyone, quote, subject to a court order, unquote, in which they were found to be a threat to a domestic partner or child.
In June of 2021, you changed the department's asylum rules so that it could apply to individuals with significant gang violence.
59 times, and then, harmed a bunch of other people, 500 and something.
Most apparent here, a defense of the Second Amendment, which this most certainly is.
Weim says the Missouri law exposes people to greater harm by interfering with the federal government's ability to enforce firearms regulations.
Well, because he was shooting from an elevated position, he was shooting what is called plunging fire, which is down on an area.
Zaki Rahimi, an accused drug dealer in Texas whose partner obtained a restraining order in February of 2020, is one such person. During an incident in an Arlington, Texas parking lot the previous year, recounted by the federal government in court papers, Rahimi was accused of knocking the woman to the ground, dragging her to his car and pushing her inside, knocking her head on the dashboard in the process. He also allegedly fired a shot from his gun after realizing that a bystander was watching.
We can expect in the future that more people will be carrying handguns on the streets in places like Los Angeles, Boston, and New York City.
As many of you out there, either parents, relatives, and/or victims yourself,
to do anything about what the president is doing to exercise that authority unconstitutionally, as was the case with student loans.
Because people buy hundreds of guns legally and then they sell them illegally.
While the protective order was in effect, Rahimi was implicated in a series of shootings, including one incident in which he allegedly fired bullets into a house using an AR-15 rifle, the federal government says. Rahimi faced state charges for the domestic attack and another attack against a different woman. He was prosecuted separately for violating the federal gun restriction law and, before the Supreme Court had issued its new gun rights ruling, argued that the case should be dismissed because of his Second Amendment right to bear arms. Claim rejected. A federal judge rejected the claim, noting that the law had previously been upheld. On appeal, the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans initially reached the same conclusion.
Inventing the pistol stabilizing brace to help his friend, a disabled combat veteran, at the shooting range.
You gave testimony that the brave ATF agents are the ones showing up at 2 in the morning after a burglary.
Do any of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle give a whit about separation of powers?
Connecticut delegation, which is incredible. I think on this issue and many others, you're the best delegation in the United States.
No guns were lost. They were stolen by an individual who's now in prison.
And of course, we've got a lot of criticism over this. So why is it not a machine gun?
In areas that are poor, mostly minority, there's a mass shooting.
Congress wants to change the law and come up with a new interpretation, then ATF will follow that new interpretation.
Then the Supreme Court issued the Bruin decision. As a result, the appeals court heard additional briefing and abruptly changed course, ruling in March that because of the expansion of gun rights, the law, quote, fails to pass constitutional muster, unquote. It is Rahimi's case the Biden administration has asked the Supreme Court to hear, with Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar saying in court papers that the appeals court ruling was, quote, profoundly mistaken, unquote. The decision threatens grave harms for victims of domestic violence, she said. Even under the Bruin standard, the law should be upheld, Prelogar said, because there is a long history of the government disarming people who are a danger to others. Meanwhile, challenges to other provisions of federal law are gathering steam in lower courts.
She proves you can run for office ending gun violence in the South and you can win.
AK-47 is an automatic Kalashnikov model of 1947.
You can prevent the next tragedy. You can save life. You can save families. In the process,
started just like, wow, it doesn't fit the definition, it doesn't fit the rulings, but we better run this up the chain.
Some months later, during an ATF audit, I was told the background check was now a non-approval.
Because they like the outcome of the policy, the banning of a piece of plastic.
Targeting another provision. Earlier this month, the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia targeted another provision, 922G1, that prohibits felons from possessing guns.
ATF agreed to, in 2012, should not be under the jurisdiction of your rule.
The court ruled that the law was unconstitutional as applied to people convicted of nonviolent crimes. In reaching that conclusion, the court said there was no historical tradition of people being disarmed after being convicted of nonviolent crimes. Other rulings on different provisions, including ones prohibiting people under felony indictment and users of illegal drugs from possessing firearms, have followed a similar pattern. Both gun control advocates and gun rights supporters agree that the court should take up the Rahimi case because the Bruen case has led to such disparate results in lower courts.
That requirement for showing a heightened need for self-defense, that was the teeth of these permitting laws.
And within less than 15 minutes, you can walk out the front door here with a rifle or a shotgun.
American citizens in places like New Orleans and Baltimore and St. Louis begin to seek asylum in countries like Honduras and Guatemala.
I don't know if you're referring to any particular incident.
Quote, "We would be thrilled to get further clarification from the court on these issues," said William Sack, a lawyer at Firearms Policy Coalition, a gun rights group. For those favoring gun control, the hope is that there is a majority on the Supreme Court that will uphold long-standing provisions like the one at issue in the Rahimi case. To do so without overturning Bruen, they would need to find that those restrictions are consistent with the historical understanding of the Second Amendment. The path to victory likely involves winning the votes of Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh.
Get on the ground now!
I'm a federal agent.
917-110-3.
I'm a federal agent.
Get on the ground!
to run enhanced background checks on young people under 21 trying to buy a firearm.
This government can protect its own people, except for 36 out of every 100,000 for murders.
Types of disputes that would be settled by people yelling at each other, maybe engaging in a fist fight, are being settled with guns.
The thoughts that matter. Although both were part of the 6-3 conservative majority in Bruen, Kavanaugh wrote a separate concurring opinion joined by Roberts, in which he outlined what he called, quote, the limits of the court's decision, unquote, making it clear that the Second Amendment does allow for gun regulations. Citing previous court rulings, Kavanaugh specifically highlighted the prohibition on the possession of firearms by felons and people with mental illnesses as an example of laws that were not under threat.
I'm just inspired by the next generation. I think it's a time for a big change.
Since you rewrote the rules of asylum based on the perceived degree of violence in these countries.
Selling more guns in the last 3 weeks than we did in the last 8 months.
But for me, and for most of you, here's what it really is. It's an important first step.
When somebody bump fires, think of this as a bump fire stock and able to move.
To be clear, this wasn't based on violence. This is based on threats specifically to individuals, on gangs.
Quote, if you add up the votes, the two of them together, Roberts and Kavanaugh, were necessary for the majority. I think everything they said will guide them on when they are looking at the next case, said Janet Carter, a lawyer at Everytown for Gun Safety, a group that backs gun restrictions.
I don't really see the purpose of letting other people that don't really know what harm they can do.
You specifically said that.
But I said...
What does mandatory mean?
I'm trying to say that...
Does it mean that prosecutors get a choice?
I would expect to see in the coming months and years is a lot of focus on whether or not enough places are deemed sensitive right now.
The Attorney General himself, Ken Paxton, tweeted saying, quote, what we just witnessed is illegal.
It's not ruled to be attached as a short-barreled rifle. It will not be subject to the rule.
What led to this? It was the 199th mass slaying of the year thus far in the United States. On a Saturday, a gunman in Allen, Texas opened fire at an outdoor shopping mall, slaying 8 people, 3 of whom were children. But even as the bloodshed prompted another push to increase restrictions on guns, a concurrent series of court battles had been wrestling with the question of where the constitutional right to bear arms ends and where the government's right to impose controls begins. That debate had been kicked into overdrive following a Supreme Court decision last June that limited legislators' ability to restrict firearm possession in public, offering a broad interpretation of the Second Amendment of the Constitution, the basis for gun rights in the United States. The ruling led to an explosion in court challenges, said Nick Suplina, a senior vice president of law and policy at Everytown for Gun Safety, a nonprofit that supports stricter gun laws. Suplina explained that the June decision really emboldened the farthest fringes of the pro-gun movement to say that everything that you could possibly think of in the realm of gun safety is unconstitutional.
Brace that this letter was responsive to. Are you telling me that this brace is exempt from your rule?
We are not finished. We are not finished. We are not finished.
Not one more! Not one more! Not one more!
The most serious readily provable offenses in cases where mandatory minimums are present because it's not warranted.
How those court battles played out could shape the landscape of gun control for generations, and eventually determine state and federal legislators' ability to enact lasting gun law. This moment is really important because expansive, unprecedented readings of the Second Amendment could lead to challenges of life-saving gun laws, Suplina said.
It could make criminals out of law-abiding citizens, and they've done that in the past.
To make this legal is to remove the 10-inch upper from this Daniel defense gun.
Or you have to remove it or you become a criminal, and people get worried about that, you know?
It's illegal to own unless you have a permit or a tax stamp.
The ATF decided to change a regulation or an interpretation of the regulation, and so they may just want to SBR right off the bat.
To actually make laws without congressional approval. They're really there to enforce laws.
The ruling that started it all. The current era of legal flux began with June's ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which was based on 2008's District of Columbia versus Heller. That precedent determined a citizen's right to bear arms is not connected to service in a militia, two concepts linked in the Second Amendment. The Bruin case directly challenged a New York law that required gun owners to prove they had a special need to carry a firearm in public. The ruling deemed the New York law unconstitutional, saying the constitutional right to carry a gun extends beyond the home. Conservative Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas wrote the majority opinion, which called for any new gun restrictions to pass two tests.
You're not exempting the same brace that you gave this letter to.
If the brace is submitted, we'll classify it.
Conventional wisdom was we would never get any Republicans to support gun legislation, period.
Are ones where, in fact, it's most likely that they should be bringing the highest and mandatory minimum.
First, the weapon in question must fall under the auspices of the Second Amendment. Second, the government must justify any restrictions on the right to bear arms by, quote, demonstrating that it is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, unquote. That second item has proven to be particularly disruptive to gun control measures. Thomas defined historical tradition as being rooted in measures that were placed when the Second Amendment was ratified in 1791, or even when the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. That amendment decrees that state laws cannot override federal laws. While modern-day gun restrictions do not need an exact historical twin, they must be proven analogous to a past restriction, Thomas wrote, although he did not clearly state from which time period that analogy must be found. Nevertheless, the ruling sent lawyers sifting through centuries-old U.S. and English law to find comparable measures that restricted weaponry. In some cases, gun control advocates pointed to bans on billy clubs or other atypical weapons. In other cases, they were forced to refer to racist laws that showed the U.S. had withheld gun ownership in the past from groups deemed dangerous, including free black people, indigenous groups, and Catholics. The problem is that, quote, we're not even talking about historical regulations from a century ago, unquote, said Eric Rubin, an assistant professor at Southern Methodist University's Dedman School of Law. Those are too recent. The Supreme Court said the historical regulations that now have to be put forward in order to justify the constitutionality of a modern gun law have to date from the late 1700s or maybe the 1800s, he told media sources. The government and litigants in courts are struggling with how to analogize those historical regulations from a very different time with very different problems and very different technology to the modern day.
Details of the law, but folks, listen at home. Here's a quick summary of what this law is doing. It's already allowing.
Demonstrating that blind loyalty to Speaker Dade Phelan is more important than upholding their oath of office.
Might end up being a message amendment because the President of the United States will almost assuredly veto it.
Would you please quit telling this committee that the brace has changed and that's why you did the...
Rather unfortunate. In the 8 months immediately after the ruling, an analysis by Jacob Charles, an associate professor at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law, found there had been 212 claims adjuncted in the courts across the U.S., challenging pre-existing gun restrictions based on Bruin. In at least 31 of the claims, the courts ruled in favor of the challenger. Those cases include successful claims against requirements for licenses to carry guns, weapon bans, and bans on so-called untraceable ghost guns, the report showed. More recently, pro-gun groups cited the Bruin ruling in an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, seeking to block Illinois' past ban on attack-style rifles and large-capacity mags. They argued there is, quote, no historical analog to such a ban, unquote. A lower court, however, previously ruled the ban fits within the history of firearm regulation. If the conservative-dominated Supreme Court did take the case, its ruling could have wide-ranging implications for the future of such bans. Meanwhile, particular controversy surrounded a February ruling from the Fifth Circuit District Court, which struck down a federal law that prevented individuals accused of domestic hurt who are subject to protective orders from possessing a gun. The administration of President Joe Biden petitioned the Supreme Court to take on the case, which contradicted several of the rulings, although the top justices had yet to announce if they would do so.
The ATF is not supposed to make law. That is supposed to be left up to Congress.
Or just take it off and store it far away. You'll be safe.
What changed is that that item that was submitted was not produced and was not the item that was marketed.
What about Colombia?
I don't know.
23 per 100,000.
Ludicrous. That doesn't happen. We are the lawful, legal citizens of the state.
But the prevailing ambiguity left domestic hurt survivors at risk, according to Mariam Durrani, Vice President of Policy at the National Domestic Violence Hotline. For instance, in Mississippi, she noted that even in domestic violence cases where a protective order had been granted, the, quote, person who harmed you no longer has to turn in their firearm. It's no longer unlawful for them to possess their firearm, unquote. What's really unfortunate and terribly dangerous is that when survivors leave their hurtful relationship or make moves to leave a hurtful relationship in order to protect themselves, that's the most dangerous time and one of the highest times for homicide, Durrani explained. Data from the hotline showed a 56.6% uptick in calls mentioning firearms in the states covered by the Fifth Circuit Court, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, between February 2nd and March 9th, compared with the same time period the previous year. While we recognize correlation is not causation, these numbers are certainly suggestive and frankly alarming, Durrani said. Domestic hurt has also shown to play a disproportionate role in mass slayings. One 2021 study found that nearly 60% of shootings with 4 or more victim fatalities between 2014 and 2019 were related to domestic violence.
Holding it a certain way, it'll continue to bump back and forth against my trigger finger.
Which many have described as the most significant gun safety law in 30 years, and it is.
So you say that the brace changed, and so you had to implement this rule.
The consequences ahead. Judicial discord has reigned since the Supreme Court's Bruin ruling, said Rubin, the law professor at Southern Methodist University. As with the domestic violence restriction, other gun control measures have been subject to conflicting rulings from federal courts across the country, Rubin explained. They include age limits for gun carry, a ban that would prevent people under federal indictment from acquiring a gun, restrictions on high-capacity mags, and a measure that would prohibit possession of firearms with altered serial numbers. Rubin said further clarity is needed from the Supreme Court for the full implications of the Bruin ruling to be made clear. But in the meantime, he warned of potential, quote, downstream consequences, unquote. Legislators, for instance, may be discouraged from pursuing restrictions they fear will be quickly struck down. For his part, Everytown's subpoena said that legislators have largely not been chilled into inaction and continue to move forward with ambitious reforms in many states. He added that he believed many gun restrictions would stand after the Bruin ruling. We are confident the Supreme Court did not intend to give a limitless interpretation of the Second Amendment in the Bruin case. We hope it takes the opportunity to make that clear to lower court judges across the country, he said. Doug Letter, chief legal officer of the gun control advocacy group Brady, also said he was optimistic about the prospect of proving that gun regulations are part of a historical U.S. tradition. He said, quote, the present moment is an opportunity for governments to pass constitutional, life-saving gun laws that are consistent with the Supreme Court's decisions in Heller and Bruin. It is imperative that governments do so. Many lives depend on it." Unquote. The problematic Illinois ban. The Supreme Court in May declined to block a new law in Illinois that bans attack-style weapons such as the AR-15 semi-auto rifle, which has been used in multiple mass incidents. The decision in a brief unsigned order meant that Illinois law enacted in the wake of a 4th of July shooting in the city of Highland Park that claimed the lives of 7 would remain in effect while legal challenges continued. In a separate case, a federal judge blocked the law, but the 7th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals had put that decision on hold. The Supreme Court in January also declined to block new New York gun restrictions. The two decisions, taken together, indicated the justices were willing to give lower courts time to consider the impact of the Supreme Court's ruling last summer that dramatically expanded gun rights under the Constitution's Second Amendment. The appeals court also expedited the consideration of 5 different cases challenging the new law. The Illinois Supreme Court seemed to be considering a similar case. A local gun ordinance in Naperville, Illinois that bars attack-style weapons would also remain in effect as a result of the Supreme Court action. Dudley Brown, president of the National Association for Gun Rights, one of the groups involved in the challenge, predicted that the Supreme Court would ultimately decide the issue. Commonly owned weapons are protected by the Second Amendment and banning them has to stop, he said. The state law enacted in January banned what the state defined as quote-unquote attack weapons, including the AR-15 rifle as well as large-capacity mags that held more than 10 rounds of ammunition for a long gun or more than 15 rounds of ammunition for handguns. The law did not ban any handguns. It did not affect people who already own the firearms covered by the ban. A spokeswoman for Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul said communities in Illinois will continue to benefit from this important public safety measure as the litigation moved forward. Gun rights activists, including Robert Bevis, a gun store owner in Naperville, sued to block the local ordinance and the state law, saying the measures violate their right to bear arms under the Second Amendment. Thus, the Supreme Court ruling last year prompted a new wave of lawmaking in Democratic-leaning states, even as America continues to be haunted by regular mass incidents. States and cities should have the right to stop these weapons of war from decimating our communities, said Chris Brown, president of the gun control group Brady. Illinois remains to be one of 10 states that has a ban on what gun control advocates call attack weapons, several of which have been enacted in the last year. Gun laws passed in 2022. Several high-profile mass incidents and a sustained rise in gun violence across the United States in 2022 spurred law enforcement officials and lawmakers to push for more gun control measures. President Joe Biden in June signed into law the first major gun safety legislation passed in decades. The measure failed to ban any weapons, but it included funding for school safety and state crisis intervention programs. Many states, including California, Delaware, and New York, also passed new laws to help curb gun violence, such as regulating untraceable ghost guns and strengthening background check systems. The year 2022 was the second highest year of mass slayings in the United States on record. There had been at least 647 mass incidents through December 31 last year. The country saw 692 mass incidents in 2021, the worst year on record since the Gun Violence Archive began tracking mass incidents in 2014. The Gun Violence Archive, like CNN, defines a mass incident as one of which at least 4 people are shot, excluding the shooter. There is a direct correlation in states with weaker gun laws and higher rates of gun incidents, including homicides, self-hurt cases, and accidental slayings. But not everyone agrees increased gun control is the answer. Some Americans advocate for their right to keep and bear arms enshrined in the Constitution, while others argue gun control measures save lives and do not infringe on citizens' rights. Amid this debate, some lawmakers forged ahead with passing gun control laws. States continue to lead on gun safety, passing new and innovative policies that will work to replicate across the country while continuing to secure significant investments in community violence intervention programs, said Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Actions, which has been fighting for gun safety measures since the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School incident in Connecticut, which claimed the lives of 20 children and 6 educators. This progress and our electoral victories in November shows that the gun violence prevention movement is stronger than ever and sets the stage for continued progress in the new year, Watts continued. More on what happened. On June 25th, Biden signed into law the bipartisan Safer Communities Act after the House and Senate approved the measure. The package represented the most significant federal legislation to address gun violence since the expired 10-year weapons ban of 1994. God willing, it's going to save a lot of lives, Biden said at the White House as he signed the bill. The package included $750 million to help states implement and run crisis intervention programs, which can be used to manage red flag programs, as well as other crisis intervention programs such as mental health, drug, and veteran courts. Red flag laws approved by the federal measure, also known as Extreme Risk Protection Order laws, they allow courts to temporarily seize firearms from anyone believed to be a danger to themselves or others. The legislation encourages states to include juvenile records in the National Instant Criminal Background Check system, which would provide a more comprehensive background check for people between 18 and 21 who want to buy guns. It has also required more individuals who sell guns as primary sources of income to register as federally licensed firearm dealers, which are required to administer background checks before they sell a gun to someone. The law barred guns from anyone convicted of a domestic violence crime who has a, quote, continuing serious relationship of a romantic or intimate nature, unquote.
Not in the same safe, not in the same car, not in the same bag. Keep them separate.
When it comes to brace technology for pistols, there really wasn't all that much.
They, the ATF, do not want you to put a rifle sight on a pistol.
You know, the braces were a lot different back then. Most of the time you just saw people with like a foam cover over the buffer tube.
They don't want you to shoulder it and have a sight that requires a cheek weld with maybe a 1 or 2 inch eye relief.
The law, however, allowed those convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence crimes to restore their gun rights after 5 years if they hadn't committed other crimes. Republicans continue to counter that the right to possess firearms is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, and that new gun control legislation would be counterproductive. Then, because of the nature of U.S. government, little changes on a national level. We have to do more to stop gun violence, U.S. President Joe Biden said after the April mass incident that claimed 6 lives at a school in Nashville, Tennessee. It's ripping our communities apart. But doing more, at least on the national level, seems to be faced with a number of serious obstacles. Old roadblocks in Congress. In the weeks after 20 children and 6 adults were lost at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut in 2012, a majority of U.S. senators supported passing legislation requiring expanded background checks for gun purchases. But because of the filibuster, a parliamentary procedure that requires at least 60 votes in the 100-seat Senate to pass most legislation, a simple majority was not enough. Another school tragedy in Uvalde, Texas in 2022, the House of Representatives, then controlled by the Democrats, approved an attack weapons ban, but the measure stalled in the Senate. Although polls indicated majorities of Americans supported such an effort, many Republican senators represented states with large pro-gun communities, and the Republican voters who support lawmakers needed to win primary elections, the selection process within each party, were even more opposed to reform. So, unless sentiment shifted amongst that constituency, the Republicans were unlikely to change course. With the House of Representatives back in Republican hands, it seemed much more probable that the chamber would try to expand gun rights, not limit them. On state level, although congressional efforts at sweeping gun control were stymied in 2015, gun control activists made substantive progress in passing new laws at the state level. In Connecticut, for instance, there was overwhelming support for reform from the communities still reeling from the brutality of the Sandy Hook attack. Other Democratic-controlled states like New York, Maryland, and California passed their own legislation closing gun show loopholes, limiting mag sizes, and prohibiting the sale of certain types of firearms. But the states that have the political majorities to pass gun control regulations have already done so, and in many Republican-controlled states, the momentum on the gun issue is towards less regulation, not more. In April, Florida became the 26th state, all Republican, to allow its residents to carry a concealed handgun without a government license.
You know, misinterpretations by the ATF in the future. And so that could be one reason why somebody might want to SBR.
And you can apply for that. That's one way to go ahead and make this legal. You can apply for the tax stamp right now. 10-inch AR-15 pistol with pistol brace is now considered an SBR.
They own multiple pistols. You know, I have a 9mm, 10mm, 7.62 by 3.9.
You can apply for the tax stamp and not pay the $200 fee. It's a one-time fee.
We're pro-Second Amendment, but at the same time, we want to take your Second Amendment rights away from you.
Democratic politicians in those states, frustrated by the lack of progress, cited recent school incidents as reason to act. Nashville Mayor John Cooper denounced what he called the cult of the gun in comments made shortly after his city's violence. The country needs to pick itself up and say no to an attack weapon lobby that again is making it too available and too convenient and too first of mind for people to go out and commit terrible acts, he said. Tennessee is one of the states with broad protections for permitless gun ownership, a fact the state's national politicians have celebrated. In 2021, Nashville's congressional representative Andy Ogles sent a Christmas photo of his family in which all but the youngest child was carrying some type of firearm. The very atmosphere of firearms anywhere and everywhere restrains evil interference. They deserve a place of honor with all that's good, the congressman said in a holiday message accompanying the photo online. Courts yet another battleground. Even if the political calculus change in Congress or among states hostile to enacting gun control legislation, there was a significant and growing obstacle to any attempts at reform: the courts. In 2008, a narrow 5-4 majority in the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which says, quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," unquote, guarantees a personal right to possess a handgun. That interpretation, although subject to furious debate, has embedded gun ownership rights in the text of the Constitution itself. And since that decision, the courts have only become more supportive. One of President Donald Trump's lasting legacies was to appoint hundreds of conservative judges to the federal courts, including naming 3 new Supreme Court justices. Last year, 2 Trump-appointed appellate court judges in California struck down a state law prohibiting the sale of attack rifles to those under the age of 21. That opinion, if upheld by the Supreme Court, could be of particular relevance given that the perpetrators in Uvalde and Sandy Hook fall into that category. America would not exist without the heroism of the young adults who fought and died in our Revolutionary Army, one of the judges wrote at the time. Today, we reaffirm that our Constitution still protects the right that enabled their sacrifice.
Sensitive places doctrine was not at issue in this case and still exists.
He went on to say he looks forward to a quick resolution in the Texas Senate.
So what happens is I pull the gun into my trigger finger.
Who are prepared and carry a gun oftentimes have to make split-second decisions.
That are not
Is this brace exempt from your rule?
I can't sit here and classify.
This is the brace who wrote the letter.
The right of young adults to keep and bear arms. And let us remind you, the Supreme Court struck down a New York law last year that restricts who may obtain concealed handgun license, with Justice Clarence Thomas firmly grounding a broad right to own and carry firearms in the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Second Amendment guaranteed to all Americans the right to bear commonly used arms in public subject to certain reasonable, well-defined restrictions, he wrote in a 6-3 opinion that was joined by 5 other conservative justices on the court. With gun laws already on the books being ruled unconstitutional, it appeared likely that any new laws would face legal challenges as well and may not survive long. Ownership on the rise. One is that Americans have more guns now than they ever did before. U.S. gun sales reached a record 23 million in 2020, a 65% increase from 2019, and remained high in 2021. The FBI conducted significantly more firearm background checks required by law when someone buys a gun during times of uncertainty like the first COVID-19 lockdown in March 2020, the unrest following the police slaying of George Floyd, and the U.S. Capitol riots in January 2021. Josh Horowitz, co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, said the rise in sales is tied to the idea that guns keep us safe, especially in uncertain times. Mr. Horowitz added that the rise in violence, especially in public places like petrol stations, dance studios, and nightclubs, fuels a cycle of fear that drives some people towards firearms. People are afraid, and they want to quell that fear by buying a gun, he said. Distress, law, and social trends. Some experts also point to the rise in life stressors, both in general and as a result of the pandemic, especially hardships related to finances, employment, or family and relationships. These issues can lead some people to act out or respond violently, said Jacqueline Schilkerot, the interim executive director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the nonpartisan Rockefeller Institute of Government. This is reflected in an analysis by the U.S. Secret Service of 173 mass casualty attacks, around 3/4 of which were carried out by a firearm. The report found that nearly 93% of assailants had dealt with a personal issue prior to their attack, whether it be divorce, health problems, or issues at school or work, and that 10% of assailants behind mass casualty events between 2016 and 2020 passed away by self-hurt. Ms. Shacklerot also says toxic masculinity could factor in as well. Nearly all mass shooters, around 98%, are male. If we are trying to understand the root causes of gun violence, we need to start by understanding why people pick up firearms in the first place, to inflict harm, regardless of the target of that harm, she said. Laws around who can purchase a gun in the US could also be playing a role. Some experts have said, though it is important to note that California has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. However, Mr. Horwitz said federal law currently does not require that background checks be made on private sales of guns, including at gun shows or online. Laws on safe storage of firearms are also lax in some states, he said, despite research evidence showing that stowing a gun away safely reduces the overall number of firearm passings. When you compare what is going on in the US to other countries, the one thing that they don't necessarily have that we have is just such easy access to firearms, Mr. Horwitz said. And that's it for this video, folks. We'll see you next time at the next video.